Hello, Dungeon Dudes. Welcome back to the second episode of Encounter of the Week. Today's encounter is a one that is quite special to my heart, as I have been in love with the series that this monster came from for a while. Now, of course, the legend of this monster dates far before the actual movies of Pirates of the Caribbean came out. Of course, I am talking about the Kraken. I thought it would be a cool idea to give you a stat block similar to what I think the Kraken could do and how it could work in a D&D based setting. I hope you all enjoy this week's edition of Monster of the Week. As always, I've written a short description of the monster so that you can get some backstory behind what this monster kind of is. Arisen from the sinking depths comes the Kraken, a ferocious monster resembling a giant squid. This fearsome monster is known to sink ships and drag unsuspecting sailors to the depths. The Kraken is a monster of gargantuan proportion, who knows no sympathy for other beings. It only knows its innate purpose: to destroy. Now, first things first, seeing as the Kraken is quite the threat in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, I thought it only right to make it a legendary creature. This gives it things such as legendary actions and other legendary abilities that I will go over when we get there in the stat block. The first thing, of course, you will see is that it is a gargantuan monstrosity who is, of course, unaligned. Now, I say unaligned, however, you can actually run the Kraken however you want. There are multiple ways you could run this monster, and it could be aligned based on how you run it. However, if you're running it just as a random monster encounter, it'll of course be unaligned. Moving on to its armor class, it has a 15 for natural armor, seeing as the Kraken was based off of a giant squid. They're not the most durable things in the world, and seeing as how big they are, especially when coming out of the water, they aren't going to be able to dodge. However, the Kraken does have a quite massive 280 hit point pool and a swimming speed of 240 feet, which I know is insane, but if you've ever seen squids or octopi move in the water, you know exactly why its speed is that high. Next, we move to its statistics, and of course we will start with its strength, being a 26. After all, it has to have the ability to yank around and pull ships even under the water when it does enough damage, therefore it needed to have quite the massive strength. Of course, a 14 in dex, seeing as even though it's quite nimble under the water, most of the time in order to combat with your players, it will need to be above water. Next up, we have its constitution at 26 as well, as it is quite the beefy creature. Next up, we have a 4 for intelligence, as of course it is nothing more than a giant animal in real life. However, you can play it as a bit more of an intelligent creature if you would like. However, I went with a 4 for just a baseline. A 16 wisdom to give it a decent perception, as this thing is decently perceptive, especially while under the water. A 2 in charisma, as it is nothing more than a hulking beast, made sense to me, seeing as it's not going to be persuading anyone to do anything anytime soon, although it could end up intimidating a couple of people. Next up, we will move to its saving throws, with a proficiency in both constitution and strength, making both of those saving throws a plus 14. Next up, I actually gave the Kraken a damage vulnerability to specifically fire, as of course the thing is a sea monster, and in the movies we see that fire is actually quite more effective than any other source of damage that the crew in Pirates of the Caribbean actually does to the hulking beast. Next up, we have damage resistances, which will include bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, as the Kraken does not seem too affected by any of the weapons that are doing bludgeoning, slashing, or piercing in the movies. And I gave it a damage immunity to cold, as of course it is able to go to great depths without feeling any effects whatsoever, so cold made sense. Next up, it has commission immunities to deafened and prone, as it literally doesn't have any hearing, and of course it is in the water constantly. You can't really knock things prone that are in the water. Next up, it has a tremor sense of 240 feet. This is mainly for basically when it has its tendrils and tentacles on the ship, it can basically feel all throughout the ship and sense who is on and where it is, so that it doesn't have to actually use its eyes to kind of pick out where the people are and kill them. Next up, a passive perception of 17 allows it to try and detect anything sneaking away from it. I gave it a challenge rating of 20, seeing as it is a legendary creature and it is gargantuan, meaning that you have to find a more unique way to actually fight this thing, and of course with that territory comes a proficiency bonus of +6, and of course no languages, as it is once again just a upgraded version of a normal creature in real life, and they don't speak languages either. Next, we move into some of its special abilities, the first of which is Legendary Resistance that it can use 3 times a day. If the Kraken fails a saving throw, it can choose to succeed instead. This is pretty common among most legendary monsters as well as legendary actions, as we will go over those later. However, I thought it would be very good since the Kraken does have low intelligence and low charisma. If your wizards or your spellcasters are trying to perhaps get it with a banishment spell, it can use one of those legendary resistances to, once again, not be banished. Next up, it is classified as a siege monster, which means it deals double damage to objects and structures. This is specifically really good for one of its actions later that actually does specifically damage to the ship or other structure it is holding. Finally, we have magical resistance, which means that the Kraken has advantage on all saving throws against spells and other magical effects, once again meaning that it is less likely to fail things like intelligence, charisma, or even other saving throws against spells. Next, we will move on to the actions that the Kraken can take. It has a multi-attack for its first action, where it makes 6 tentacle attacks and 2 ink spray attacks, seeing as it has quite a number of tentacles, and it is of course a high-level creature needing to deal a lot of damage in a large burst, as it will only get 1 turn while your players wail on it. The tentacle attacks that are included within the multi-attack are melee weapon attacks with a +14 to hit, a reach of 5 feet, and are 1 target. The hit does 20 or 2d10 plus 8 bludgeoning damage, and on a hit, a creature must make a DC 22 strength saving throw or be knocked prone. Next up, we have the ink spray, which is also part of the multi-attack. When it is a ranged weapon attack with a +8 to hit, a range of 30 and a long distance of 60 feet with 1 target. It has a 24 or 4d8 plus 4 cold damage, and on a hit, the creature must make a DC 22 Constitution saving throw or be paralyzed. Its final action is known as Gargantuan Crush, which recharges on a 5 or a 6, which basically means that it activates like a Dragon's Breath weapon, where essentially it will use it on its first turn, it's automatically recharged on the first turn of combat. However, each consequential turn, the DM will roll a d6, and if the DM rolls a 5 or a 6, they basically get to use Gargantuan Crush again. If not, they will just revert to the multi-attack. Next up, we come to the Kraken's bonus action called Crushing Grip. Now, remember when I mentioned that siege monster ability would be useful later? Well, this is where it comes into handy. So, as a bonus action, the Kraken can constrict the structure it is currently holding, dealing 50 or 10d8 bludgeoning damage to the part of the structure it is holding. Now, because it deals double damage, this doesn't mean it just deals 50, no, rather it will deal 100 to the structure itself. And if you're wondering, this also means that if you were to roll the 10d8, you would roll the 10d8 and then double said damage. Next, we head over to the Kraken's reactions, where it has Fathomless Onslaught. If the Kraken takes damage from a spell or other magical effect, including magical weapons, it can use its reaction to deal 16 or 4d6 cold damage to the creature who damaged the Kraken. Finally, we move on to the Kraken's legendary actions. Now, seeing as this is the first time I have done legendary actions on a creature for these encounters of the week, I will explain how legendary actions work. Now, the Kraken itself has 3 legendary actions that recharge at the start of its turn. As a DM, you can decide whether or not you want them to recharge at the start of the Kraken's turn or the end of the Kraken's turn, and you can also decide whether or not the Kraken has 3 to 5 legendary actions, but I put 3 as a baseline, seeing it as It is not a higher level legendary creature, but technically, in terms of legendary creatures, a lower level. It has 3 legendary actions that it can use. The first one costs 1 legendary action and is called Tentacle, where the Kraken makes an additional tentacle attack. The next one is just the same thing, but for the Ink Spray attack. So basically, you say Ink Spray, it costs 1 action, and the Kraken makes an additional Ink Spray attack. Finally, Gargantuan Crush costs all 3 of its legendary actions, and the Kraken uses its Gargantuan Crush action. Now, how legendary actions basically work is that at the end of anyone's turn, including the Kraken's, it can choose to use a legendary action. If it doesn't, everything continues as normal, but if it does, it spends some points to basically use the different abilities. Next, we will move on to 3 potential encounters for the Kraken. The first of which being the typical run-of-the-mill encounter you would have with the Kraken I have just basically given to you, and that would be your party sailing on a ship and just randomly running into the Kraken as a random monster encounter. Now, seeing as this is quite a strong monster, I would suggest running this against a pretty strong party, or a party with a lot of support on the ship, such as bunch of crewmates, maybe a bunch of soldiers, something of the sort. But if you have a higher level party, maybe it's just the Kraken attacking your party. It's all up to, of course, your discretion as the DM. Try to balance it out, as this is a CR20 monster. However, once again, much like the Deathclaw, if your party doesn't do good at single target damage, maybe you shouldn't just have your party face this monster. The next potential encounter is actually one that is a personal favorite of mine, and you have it basically working for your big bad evil guy in a sort of seafaring campaign. Much like how Pirates of the Caribbean had the Kraken be Davy Jones's sort of pet slash monster abomination thing, you could have your big bad evil guy, or maybe villain of the arc, and have it control the Kraken to do various nefarious deeds across the high seas, causing it to be an looming threat over the party for the entire arc and or campaign. The final Kraken encounter idea that I could come up with was maybe the Kraken is a guardian of sorts for some sort of underwater tomb. You could write it any sort of ways, but it could act as a sphinx. Maybe it is hyper intelligent and talks to the party, or maybe it is just a guard dog that is simply set to attack all when things approach the crypt or tomb, or however you wanted to run it. I just thought it'd be a really cool idea to have this gigantic hulking monster threatening to completely obliterate your party if they came close to this sacred land. Thank you so much for watching today's installment of Encounter of the Week. I will, of course, be posting more weekly every Sunday. I can't give you an exact time as it depends on how long these take to record, edit, and all of that. And I thank you all so much for your support. As always, the link to the monster will be in the description of this video if you would like to run it in your campaign. Thank you so much for your support, and have a wonderful day.